Somewhere in Europe, maybe 30,000 years ago, maybe a little longer, the night is very cold. The kind of cold that has weight to it, that presses in from all sides and makes the dark feel closer than it is. A small group of people are gathered around a fire. You can hear the wood settling, the low crackle of it, and beyond that, almost nothing. Just wind moving across open ground and the occasional sound of breathing. Their breath comes out in slow, white clouds. They are hungry, but not desperate. Not tonight. The fire holds the worst of the world at bay, and at the edge of the firelight, just barely visible, there is a wolf. Not close enough to be a threat, not far enough to be indifferent, just watching. Dark eyes catching the orange glow, body low and still, reading something in this scene that its instincts haven't quite sorted out yet. The people around the fire probably know it's there. They've seen wolves before. They've competed with them, avoided them, maybe feared them. But tonight nobody throws a stone. Nobody shouts. The wolf doesn't run. And for a long, quiet moment, two very different kinds of animals simply share the same light. That moment, or something very much like it, is where this story begins. We don't know exactly how it happened. We have bones and genetics and careful guesswork, and we have the animals themselves, sleeping at the feet of billions of people right now on every continent on Earth. But the actual beginning, the first real crossing of that invisible line between wild and something else, that part happened in the dark, without witnesses, over thousands of years, in ways we're still trying to understand. And that uncertainty is part of what makes it so worth following. This is the entire history of the dog, or as close to it as we can get. It stretches back somewhere between 27,000 and 40,000 years, depending on which evidence you trust and which scientist you're listening to this week. The genetics keep shifting the dates slightly as the tools improve. The archaeology points to bones that are old enough to make you stop and breathe for a moment. The story moves through ice ages and the collapse of glaciers, through the first villages and the building of cities, through Egypt and Rome and the medieval countryside, through 2 world wars and the strange modern world we've built together. And through all of it, running alongside us, there's the dog. Not always understood, not always treated well, but always there. We're going to walk through it slowly. There's no rush. This is the kind of history that rewards patience. If you're listening to this right now and it's late, and the room is quiet, and you came here hoping something slow and long would carry you towards sleep, well, that's exactly why this exists. That's the whole point. So if you haven't already, subscribe maybe, and leave a comment telling me where you are in the world and what time it is. I read them, and it's one of the genuinely strange pleasures of making these. It's Jakarta at 2 in the morning, it's Edinburgh just after 9, it's someone in São Paulo who fell asleep before the middle and is just waking up now wondering where the wolves went. All at once, every time zone listening to the same fire. And if you want the full experience without any interruptions, you can follow this channel on Spotify for ad-free listening with no background music. Just the voice, just the story. There's a link in the description that'll take you straight there, and it helps keep these going, which means more nights like this one. Now, back to that wolf at the edge of the light. The question that sits at the centre of this whole history is one of the more quietly astonishing things you can ask about the natural world. How does a large predator, an animal built for speed and teeth and the open chase, how does something like that become a creature that chooses to stay near humans? Not because it was caged, not because it had no choice, but because over generations something shifted in what it wanted, in what felt safe, in what felt like home. The dog didn't just get domesticated. The dog, in some important sense, participated, and the story of how that happened is still being argued over in universities and excavation sites and genetics labs right now. We're not going to pretend we have all the answers. What we have are clues, really old clues, scattered across enormous stretches of time, in places as far apart as Siberia and Belgium and the American Southwest. We have teeth and skulls and mitochondrial DNA and the occasional ancient burial where a human and a dog were placed together in the earth, as if whoever dug the grave couldn't imagine separating them. We have art on cave walls, we have philosophy, we have the dog lying at your feet while you listen to this. All of it adds up to something. Not a clean line from wild to tame, but something messier and more interesting. A long negotiation across thousands of years between two species who happened to be good at some of the same things and figured out slowly that they were better together than apart. So let's go back. All the way back to a time before the breed names and the kennel clubs and the painted portraits of lapdogs on velvet. Before the Roman guard dogs and the Egyptian tomb paintings. before the first villages and the early farmers, back to the ice and the fire and the wolf at the edge of the dark, back to the moment before the dog had a name for what it was becoming. That's where we'll start. And we'll take our time getting there. The world that Wolf was watching from was not the world we know. That's worth sitting with for a moment, because it's easy to picture 30,000 years ago as just a dimmer, colder version of the present. It wasn't. It was a genuinely different Earth. The late Pleistocene was a time of enormous climatic instability, of ice sheets that advanced and retreated over centuries, of sea levels that dropped low enough to expose land bridges connecting continents that are now separated by open ocean. Landscapes we know as temperate forests were tundra. Coastlines that people walked on are now under 50 meters of water. The animals moving through those environments were different too. Not entirely unrecognizable, but stranger than you might expect. Woolly mammoths in numbers large enough to shape the landscape, cave bears, aurochs, giant deer with antlers wider than a modern car. The world was full in a way it hasn't been since. Full of large animals moving through open grasslands and birch forests and river valleys, dusted with ash from volcanoes that have been quiet for millennia. And through all of it, humans were moving. Small groups, following game, following water, following whatever knowledge their parents had passed down about where to go when the cold deepened. These weren't the anatomically modern humans of later prehistory, settled into patterns we might recognize. These were people in motion, carrying everything they owned, reading landscapes the way we now read screens. They were very good at surviving in conditions that would kill most of us within days, and wolves were moving through the same world. Now here is where the language starts to matter, because the words we use can mislead us if we're not careful. When we talk about the beginning of dogs, we're tempted to reach for clean terms, domestication, taming, the moment a wolf became a dog. But none of those phrases quite fit what the evidence suggests, at least not for this early period. Scientists make a distinction, sometimes a contested one, between domestication in the full sense, where a species is selectively bred over generations for human purposes, and what they call a commensal relationship, where two species begin living in proximity because it benefits both of them, without any deliberate human intention behind it. The early story of wolves and people almost certainly begins somewhere in that second category. Not a program, not a plan, just two groups of highly social, highly intelligent predators beginning to occupy overlapping space, and neither of them dying because of it. Which brings us to the question of dates, and this is where the fog thickens considerably. When you see 30,000 BC cited as a starting point for the history of dogs, including in the title of this video, what that number is really doing is gesturing toward a window. Geneticists studying the divergence between wolf and dog populations have estimated, depending on the study, the methods used, and the population sampled, that the split between wolves and what would become dogs happened somewhere between 27,000 and 40,000 years ago. Some analyses push the window even earlier, some compress it. The science keeps shifting slightly as the tools improve, and as researchers gain access to more ancient DNA. So 30,000 years ago sits more or less in the middle of a range of educated estimates. It is not a confirmed domestication date. It's a framing device, a way of saying this is approximately where the shadow of the dog first begins to separate from the shadow of the wolf. The way scientists try to see into this fog are genuinely worth understanding, because they're each telling a slightly different part of the story. Genetics can trace lineages and estimate divergence times, but it can't tell you what the relationship between those animals and humans actually looked like. Morphology, the study of bone shapes and skull measurements, can identify physical changes associated with domestication, but ancient bones are rare and often fragmentary. Isotope analysis of teeth and bones can suggest what an animal was eating, which can hint at whether it was scavenging near human camps or hunting independently. An archaeological context, where a bone was found, what it was buried with, what other remains surrounded it, can sometimes suggest something about the nature of a relationship, though carefully and with considerable caution. None of these methods alone tells the full story. Together they sketch an outline, and inside that outline there is still a great deal of open space. That space is not a failure of science. It's just the honest shape of very old things. The beginning of the dog is real. It happened. But it happened gradually in darkness, across generations too slow for any single pair of eyes to have witnessed. We are reading the traces it left behind, and we are doing our best. So what does it actually mean for a population to split? Not in the dramatic sense, not the way continents break apart or rivers change course after a flood. In the realm of living things, a split is quieter than that. It's the slow accumulation of small distances, a group of wolves in one valley, another group 200 miles north, and between them a mountain range or a stretch of open tundra that neither group crosses with any regularity. Seasons pass, generations pass. The two groups are still wolves, still fundamentally the same animal, but they're beginning to carry slightly different genetic signatures, slightly different tendencies, slightly different responses to the world around them. Nobody declared the split. Nobody witnessed it. It happened the way most important things happen, gradually, invisibly, through the patient arithmetic of time and separation. This is what paleogenomics, the study of ancient DNA recovered from old bones, has been trying to reconstruct. And the picture it's drawn, particularly over the roughly 15 years since sequencing, technology became powerful enough to work reliably with degraded ancient material, is not a clean one. It is complicated in exactly the ways you might expect a real biological process to be complicated. What the major studies, taken together, seem to suggest is something like this. Somewhere in the window we've already discussed, that broad smear of time between 27,000 and 40,000 years ago, perhaps earlier, wolf populations that were associated in some way with human groups began to diverge genetically from wolf populations that were not. The divergence wasn't sudden, it wasn't complete. It left room for mixing, for contact, for what geneticists sometimes call introgression, the flow of genes back and forth across a boundary that was never quite sealed. But it was real. Something was happening to some wolves that was not happening to others, and over time that something accumulated into a difference you could measure. The difficulty is that the ancient genomes we've managed to sequence are very few, and they come from very specific places, mostly Europe and Siberia, because those are the environments where cold temperatures have best preserved organic material across tens of thousands of years. We are not reading the full record, we are reading whatever scraps of it happened to survive in the right conditions and happened to be found by archaeologists who happened to think to send them for analysis. The map we're working from has enormous blank regions, and what falls into those blank regions matters enormously, because one of the central debates in the genetics of dog origins is whether domestication happened once, in one place, and then spread, or whether something resembling domestication happened in more than one place, perhaps independently, perhaps in populations of wolves that were already somewhat different from each other. The single origin hypothesis has had periods of dominance in the literature, particularly when studies pointed to East Asia as the most likely source of high genetic diversity in early domestic dogs. But other analyses have found signals that complicate this picture. Ancient European dogs that seem genetically distinct from ancient East Asian dogs, populations that appear to have mixed, diverged, mixed again. A lineage here that seems to vanish from the modern record entirely, replaced or absorbed by a later wave of animals moving with human migrations. What this means, practically speaking, is that the early history of the dog may not be a single branching tree but something more like a tangled shrub. Populations forming, separating, coming back into contact, exchanging genes, some lines persisting and some disappearing. Some researchers have proposed that there may have been more than one domestication event, that wolves in different parts of the Eurasian landmass may have independently begun the long process of association with humans, and that the dogs we know today carry the mixed inheritance of more than one of those starts. Others hold that the genetic evidence still points most strongly toward a single origin, with subsequent complexity introduced by migration and mixing. The debate has not resolved. The tools keep improving, and each new ancient genome recovered from a cave site or a burial mound adds a data point that sometimes clarifies things and sometimes complicates them further. What seems reasonable to hold on to, given where the evidence currently stands, is that the split was messy, that it was not a single moment but a process, that some early proto-dog lineages may have flourished for a time and then disappeared entirely, leaving no modern descendants, swallowed back into the wolf population or simply dying out, that others persisted and eventually gave rise to something we would recognize, and that the whole thing unfolded across a time span so long that the concept of progress barely applies to any individual generation living through it. Think about what that means in concrete terms. A wolf born at the edge of a human camp, slightly less fearful than its siblings, slightly more inclined to linger near the warmth and the smell of cooked meat. It would have no sense of being at the beginning of something. Its cubs, and their cubs, and the cubs after them, each generation perhaps fractionally more tolerant of human proximity, perhaps fractionally more attuned to reading the signals that human faces and human gestures make. Not because anyone selected for these traits deliberately, at least not at first, but because the environment around those animals was slightly different from the environment of the wolves who kept their distance. Different pressures, different rewards, different costs for different behaviours. Over 1,000 years this might look like almost nothing. Over 10,000 years it might look like a different kind of animal. The paleogenomic evidence, imperfect and incomplete as it is, suggests that by the time you reach the window of 30,000 years ago, give or take considerably, there were wolves whose lineages were already diverging in ways that would eventually produce the domestic dog. Not dogs yet, not in the full sense. In the full, but no longer quite the same as the wolves who had nothing to do with people. Something in between, something in transition. And what's quietly remarkable about that is the way it leaves room, even across that distance, for something like connection. The split in the wolf's shadow was real, and it was widening, but it was not a wall. It was more like a slow parting, the way two people walking the same road might gradually find themselves on slightly different paths without either of them noticing the moment of divergence. The wolves that stayed near the human camps were still wolves. The people near whose fires they slept were still doing everything they would have done without them, and yet something was forming in the space between. A bridge being built from both ends, slowly, without blueprints, across a distance that was narrowing, even as the world kept changing around it. The earliest traces of that bridge are what we'll look for next, in the fragments of bone that have survived the long cold of 30,000 years, waiting to tell us something, imperfectly, about how this began. The bone is small, smaller than you might expect given the weight of what it might mean. It came from Razboinichia Cave, a site tucked into the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, a region of cold plateaus and deep river valleys that has been attracting human attention, and the attention of the animals that followed humans for tens of thousands of years. The specimen in question is a fragment of skull, a snout, and what drew researchers to it when it was analysed and dated was this. It was old, roughly 33,000 years old by radiocarbon estimates, and it was shaped in ways that looked less like a wolf and more like something that had been drifting away from wolf for a while. The snout was shorter and broader than a typical wolf's. The teeth were crowded in ways that teeth get crowded when a jaw is compressing, when the skull is changing its proportions under pressures that wolves living entirely apart from people don't seem to face. To the researchers who first described it, the Razboinichia specimen looked, in a word, dog-like. And that word, dog-like, carries with it all the ambiguity you might want to pack into 2 syllables. Because what does it actually mean for something to look like a dog? This is where the science becomes genuinely difficult, not because the bones are hard to read, but because the signals in bone are subtle, and because morphology, the study of physical form, is not the same as proof of relationship. Animals that live in similar conditions, that eat similar things, that develop similar associations with environments or with other species, can converge on similar shapes without being closely related at all. And wolves that happen to be feeding heavily on the discarded scraps of human camps, wolves that were eating cooked food, softer food, food that didn't demand the full mechanical force that wild prey requires, might over time develop slightly shortened, slightly altered skulls without any genetic separation from their wilder counterparts having occurred at all. A wolf eating differently might look different. That doesn't necessarily make it something new. This is why the Razboinichia specimen has remained a point of debate rather than a settled case. Some researchers look at it and see an early domestic dog, or at least something far enough along the trajectory of domestication to count as incipient, a beginning. Others look at the same bones and see a morphologically unusual wolf, shaped by local conditions, by diet, by whatever particular pressures operated in that part of Siberia at that particular time. The dating has also come under scrutiny. Radiocarbon dates from cave sites can be complicated by contamination, by the mixing of materials from different periods, by the way sediments in caves don't always stay where they started. A bone that seems to belong to one layer may have moved. The date we have is real, but what the bone was and how it got there are questions that remain open. What the Razboinichia specimen does, regardless of how that debate eventually settles, is mark a place in time and space where something was happening that was at least worth a second look. The Altai Mountains in the Upper Paleolithic were not empty country. Humans were there. Evidence of human occupation stretches across the region during exactly this period. And where humans were, there were wolves in the vicinity, because wolves had been following human groups, or at least occupying the same broad territories, long before any domestication was underway. Whether the animal in that cave was beginning a transition, or simply visiting the edge of one, is a question the bones alone cannot answer. Across the other end of Eurasia, in the caves of what is now Italy, there are other candidates. The Palici cave site in Puglia and Grotta Romanelli, along the heel of the boot, both southern Italian sites associated with Upper Paleolithic human occupation, have yielded specimens that have attracted similar attention and similar debate. Fragmentary remains, teeth and jaw pieces mostly, from animals that fall into that uncertain zone between wolf and dog. The dating at these sites places the specimens somewhere in a broad window of the Upper Paleolithic, a time when anatomically modern humans had been in Europe for tens of thousands of years and were living in ways that brought them into sustained contact with the megafauna of the late Pleistocene, hunting it, eating it, and almost certainly attracting the attention of every scavenging species in the landscape. The Italian specimens have generated the same arguments as the Siberian one. The proportions are suggestive but not conclusive. The morphological signals that researchers point to, skull shape, tooth size, jaw depth, the relative crowding of the dental arcade, are real features, genuinely present in the bones. But they exist on a continuum that spans wolf variation as well, and that continuum is wide enough to leave room for honest disagreement. The scientists who study these sites are not careless people making easy claims. They are reading real patterns in real material, and the patterns are genuinely ambiguous. That ambiguity is not a failure of the science. It is what the evidence actually looks like when a process is just beginning. What the Italian sites add, beyond the morphology, is context, and context is often the more telling evidence. These were places where humans lived, not briefly but repeatedly, leaving behind the layered refuse of many visits across many generations. Hearths and broken tools and the cracked and discarded bones of hunted animals, and within that refuse sometimes the bones of large canids in positions and conditions that suggest something more than casual overlap. There are cut marks on some specimens, the fine parallel lines left by stone tools when meat is removed from bone, which tells you that whatever these animals were, some of them ended up being processed by human hands. Whether that means they were hunted as prey, scavenged after dying near camp, or something more complicated, something involving a proximity intimate enough that their deaths and the uses of their bodies were intertwined with human activity, is not something you can read from a cut mark alone. But the marks are there, and they are part of the picture. Scavenging near camps, association with human refuse middens, bones present in human occupation layers. These are the kinds of signals that archaeologists piece together when they try to reconstruct not just what was present at a site, but what the relationship between presences might have been. A wolf that kept its distance would not leave bones in the interior of a cave where humans were sleeping and cooking. Something willing to come close, something with a different threshold for proximity might. Taken together, the specimens from the Altai and from southern Italy, and a handful of other contested finds scattered across the Upper Paleolithic record of Eurasia, do not constitute proof of domestication. That claim would be too strong, too clean for what the evidence actually supports. What they constitute is something more interesting, and in some ways more haunting. They are flickers, small, uncertain lights in the deep dark of a very long timeline. They suggest that the process we're trying to trace was not sudden, that it had early chapters that left only the faintest marks, that there were animals living at the edge of human life tens of thousands of years ago, whose bones carry the first whispers of a change that would take an enormous amount of time to fully arrive. The relationship was forming, maybe, beginning to form and then retreating, or beginning in one place while another beginning was happening somewhere else. The record is too sparse to say, but the flickers are real, and something in the way they appear, in the cold stone of caves where human fires once burned, in the soil of places where people slept and ate and discarded the remnants of their days, feels like the first tentative grammar of something that would eventually become a whole language. A way of being together that neither side had ever tried before. Then, after all the flickers and the fragments, after the ambiguous morphology and the debated dates and the careful language of researchers trying not to claim more than the bones will support, there is a burial. It was found near the German town of Bonn at a site called Oberkassel in the early 20th century, unearthed by quarry workers cutting into a basalt deposit along the Rhine, and only later understood to be something remarkable. The site contained human remains, 2 of them, an older man and a younger woman, lying together in a manner that suggested deliberate placement, careful arrangement, the specific orientation of bodies that someone had chosen to put where they lay. Alongside them, touching them, buried in the same deposit and clearly part of the same interment, were the bones of a dog, a single animal, young, probably younger than 7 months at the time of its death, and bearing in its teeth and jaw evidence of a severe illness in its final weeks, something that had caused the animal significant suffering before it died. The burial has been dated to approximately 14,000 years before the present, which places it at the very end of the Pleistocene, at the tail of the last great ice age, when the climate of Europe was beginning its slow, long turn toward the warmer world we now inhabit. The humans buried there were part of a culture archaeologists call the Bonn-Oberkassel tradition, a late Upper Paleolithic population living in a landscape of retreating glaciers and recovering forests, hunting and gathering in a world that was changing around them faster than it had in a very long time. What makes the Bonn-Oberkassel dog different from everything that came before it? Different from Razbojnicia and Paglici and all the other sites where researchers have found canid remains and drawn careful tentative conclusions, is not just the age or the morphology, though the morphology is convincing. It is the context, the absolute specificity of that context. This was not a wolf bone in a human occupation layer, not a large canid present somewhere near a hearth and open to multiple interpretations. This was an animal buried with people, buried among them, touching them, placed there with the same apparent intentionality that placed the humans themselves. Whatever ritual logic governed the interment of those 2 individuals, it included the dog. That inclusion is what archaeologists mean when they talk about secure evidence of domestication. Not security in the sense of certainty about every detail, not a closed case, but security in the sense that multiple independent lines of evidence converge on the same conclusion. The morphology of the animal's bones falls within the range researchers now associate with early domestic dogs, showing the shortened facial structure, the adjusted tooth proportions, the physical signature of an animal whose lineage had been moving away from wolf for some time. The depositional context is unambiguous. The animal was buried, not discarded, not scavenged into proximity, not washed into the layer by accident. And the illness, the evidence that this animal had been severely, debilitatingly sick in the weeks before its death, carries its own kind of quiet testimony. A wolf would not have survived that illness in the wild. An animal that's sick, unable to function at full capacity, would have been lost. Something had sustained it through that period of vulnerability. Something had kept it alive long enough for it to die among people and be buried with them. That something is the word we have been building toward through all the earlier discussion of Paleolithic camps and ambiguous bones and the first uncertain chemistry between 2 species. That something is care. It is worth letting that word sit for a moment without rushing past it. Care, not utility, not the calculated maintenance of a useful tool, not the rational management of a resource. Whatever practical relationship this animal may have had with the people who buried it, whatever work it may have done or presence it may have provided in a functional sense, someone cared enough about its life to keep it alive through serious illness, and cared enough about its death to put it in the ground alongside their own dead. That is a different order of relationship entirely. The 2 earlier finds that the archaeological community has debated most seriously, and they are worth mentioning without dismissing them, are a site in the Bonn-Oberkassel tradition's broad temporal neighbourhood. There is also the roughly 12,000-year-old burial from In Malaha, in what is now Israel, where an elderly human and a puppy were found interred together, the human's hand resting on the animal's body, a gesture that even across 12 millennia of elapsed time reads unmistakably as tenderness. And there is a site from the Czech Republic and from Belgium that push the question even further back. Specimens dated to 27,000 years ago that some researchers have argued show the morphological signatures of incipient domestication. Those remains sparked significant debate. They still do. The dating has been questioned, the morphology contested, the interpretation challenged on multiple grounds. They are part of the honest, unresolved uncertainty that sits at the beginning of this story. But Bonobo Castle does not have that uncertainty. It arrived in the archaeological record fully formed, in a sense, carrying all the evidence needed to make the conclusion legible, which does not mean that what it represents began at 14,000 years ago. A burial like this one does not appear from nowhere. It assumes a history. It assumes that by the time these people put this animal in the ground with their dead, the relationship between humans and dogs was already old enough to generate that kind of attachment, already established enough that the right response to the death of a young sick dog was mourning and ritual and the same care and burial given to a person. Whatever earlier chapters produced that outcome are still partly obscured, still living in the ambiguous and contested record of all those flickers and fragments that came before. The Bonobo Castle burial is not the beginning. It is more like the first sentence in a document where we know pages were torn out earlier, and perhaps that is the most honest way to hold it. Not as a neat starting point, not as a moment of origin, but as a threshold. The first place in the record where we can stand and say, without serious qualification, that this was a dog, and that these were its people, and that something real enough to survive 14,000 years of burial and geological change passed between them. The animal was young. It had been ill. It died, by whatever path, among the humans who had kept it alive through that illness. And when it died, they did not leave it. They wrapped whatever wrapping they used, or laid whatever offerings they offered, or simply placed it as gently as one places anything that has been loved, in the ground beside themselves. In the ground that would hold the older man and the younger woman, in the stone and sediment of a world that was just then beginning to thaw. We do not know its name. We do not know what sound they made to call it, or what role it played in the rhythms of their days. We know only what the ground kept, what the basalt preserved, what the quarry workers uncovered in their cutting, and what the scientists have since read so carefully in those small bones. A life valued enough to be mourned. An animal that belonged, in whatever the deepest sense of that word was available to people who had no word for it, to someone. That is the softest kind of evidence, and it is, somehow, the most persuasive. The burial at Bonobo Castle raises a question that the bones themselves cannot fully answer. How did it happen? How does a wolf become an animal that someone buries with their dead? That someone keeps alive through illness? That someone allows close enough to the warmth of a fire and the intimacy of a camp to be touched and mourned? The answer that biology and archaeology have slowly assembled over the past few decades is stranger and more interesting than the one most people assume. And the strangeness is in this. We probably did not do it. Not deliberately. Not by design. The dogs came to us. It is worth sitting with that inversion for a moment, because it runs against the intuitive story. The intuitive story is one of human ingenuity and intention. A hunter capturing a wolf pup, raising it, training it, selecting the most useful animals for breeding. Generation by generation, the wolf becoming something else, something shaped by human purpose. It is a tidy narrative. It places us at the centre, as architects of the transformation, deliberate and prescient. And it is almost certainly not what happened, or at least not primarily, not at the beginning, not in the long, quiet centuries before anyone understood what was occurring. The model that researchers now find most compelling begins not with human hunters carrying pups home, but with wolves making a choice, or not a choice exactly, because wolves do not deliberate, but a behavioural tendency, a heritable inclination towards something that most of their kind avoided. Call it reduced fear. Call it a lower threshold for tolerance of the unfamiliar, the strange-smelling, the dangerous-seeming. Some individual wolves, across the enormous range of behavioural variation that exists in any population, were simply less frightened of people than others. They could come closer to a human camp without bolting. They could linger at the edges of a fire's light without fleeing at the first movement or sound. And that tendency, that small measurable difference in the distance at which panic sets in, had a consequence. The wolves who could come closer could eat what humans left behind, refuse piles, discarded bones, the leavings of butchery and consumption that accumulate wherever people live. This is the core of what researchers call the commensal pathway to domestication, the idea that the first step was not partnership but proximity, not cooperation but scavenging, a wolf finding an advantage in being near people and close enough to what they threw away. In a world of ice and scarcity, that advantage was not trivial. A reliable source of calories, even a marginal and irregular one, is the difference between populations that persist and populations that do not. The wolves who could tolerate human proximity ate more than the wolves who could not. They survived harsh winters at slightly higher rates. They left more offspring. Those offspring inherited, in whatever complex tangle of genetics governs behavioral temperament, some portion of their parents' tolerance. Over generations, slowly, without intention from either side, the wolves living near human camps began to shift. The most fearful individuals, the ones who fled at the first scent of a person, they were selecting themselves out of this particular ecological niche. The ones who stayed, who lingered, who learned to read the rhythms of a human camp well enough to know when the danger was low and the scraps were available, they were selecting themselves in. This is what biologists sometimes mean when they talk about selection without intention. No human being was choosing which wolves to breed. No one was examining temperament or assessing utility. The environment itself was doing the work. The specific environment of a human encampment with its warmth and its refuse and its particular pressures, and the wolves were responding to it the way any population responds to any selective pressure, generation by patient generation, the frequency of certain traits shifting in the direction that the environment rewarded. There is a famous set of experiments conducted in the 20th century in Siberia that gives this idea a kind of vivid demonstration. Researchers began selectively breeding silver foxes for one trait only: tameness, the willingness to be handled by humans without aggression or panic. Within a remarkably small number of generations, the tame foxes began to show other changes that no one had selected for. Floppy ears, curled tails, spotted coats, changes in skull shape, a tendency to remain juvenile in behavior longer than wild foxes. This cluster of traits, appearing together across different species under different conditions of domestication, is what researchers have come to call the domestication syndrome. The idea is that the genes governing stress response and fearfulness are somehow linked to the genes governing development, growth, and physical form, so that selecting for one changes the others as a kind of biological side effect. Whether the domestication syndrome applies cleanly to early dogs remains a subject of ongoing debate. The concept is useful, and it maps suggestively onto what we see in early domestic canid remains: the shortened muzzles, the adjusted proportions, the features that distinguish them from wild wolves. But it is a pattern, not a fixed rule, and the pathway from wild wolf to domestic dog almost certainly varied across different times and places, different populations of wolves and humans finding their own particular routes toward the relationship that eventually emerged, because the commensal scavenging model, compelling as it is, may not be the only pathway. There is also the possibility of pups. Young wolves are, for a window of their early lives, tractable. They can be handled. They can form attachments. People who encountered wolf pups in the wild, deliberately or accidentally, may have brought some of them back, raised them, kept the ones that remained manageable and released, or avoided the ones that did not. This is not the same as a deliberate breeding program. It is more casual than that, more opportunistic, the kind of thing that happens in a world where the boundary between wild and human-occupied space is blurred, where people are moving through landscapes full of other animals and sometimes, for whatever reason, ending up in proximity to the young of those animals. What makes the story genuinely uncertain is that it does not have to be one thing. A wolf population scavenging near human camps on one side of a mountain range, people occasionally raising pups on another. Both processes running quietly independently for long stretches of time, until at some point the animals produced by each process were similar enough that they could be considered the same kind of animal, the domestic dog, the animal that had emerged from all those varied, unplanned, geographically scattered interactions between two species who happened to find each other useful. What is clear, what the genetics and the archaeology both support in their different ways, is that this was not fast, and it was not clean, and it was not the result of anyone sitting down and deciding to invent a new kind of animal. It was the result of wolves being wolves, following the logic of survival into whatever ecological niches presented themselves, including the strange and dangerous niche that existed at the margins of a human camp, and humans being humans, tolerating and perhaps encouraging the proximity of animals that seemed less threatening than their wild cousins, that showed up predictably, that perhaps gave warning of other, less welcome presences in the dark beyond the fire. The wolves that became dogs were, in a very real sense, the wolves that chose us, not with anything we would recognize as intention, But with the accumulated choosing that happens when generation after generation, the same tendency is rewarded, and the tendency becomes a trait, and the trait becomes a lineage, and the lineage becomes, across time measured in thousands of years, something new. Something that has never existed before in the long history of either species. Something that would eventually be buried alongside its people in the cold ground of a warming world. So there was something new in the world, an animal that was neither fully wild nor fully tame, that moved at the edges of human space, that had been shaped by thousands of years of proximity into something different from the wolves that avoided people entirely. And the question that follows naturally from that, the one that is harder to answer than it might first appear, is what that animal actually did for the people it lived among, not in the abstract, not in terms of what domesticated dogs in general eventually became, but in the specific cold, difficult reality of the Ice Age world. What did that early partnership look like, on the ground, in the dark, when the glaciers were still grinding southward and the landscape was something most of us would barely recognise? Begin with hunting, because that is the most obvious and most discussed contribution. The wolves that had become comfortable near human camps had noses and ears that no human being could match. A wolf can detect scent at concentrations roughly 100,000 times lower than a human can. It can hear frequencies and distances entirely outside the range of human perception. It can move through terrain that would slow a person considerably, tracking a wounded animal through snow, through dense undergrowth, across the kinds of broken Ice Age landscapes where a human hunter, following only visual signs, could lose a trail entirely. An animal with that sensory capacity, one that had learned to move in rough coordination with a group of human hunters rather than fleeing from them, would have been genuinely transformative. Not just useful in the way that a better spear point is useful, but useful in a different order of magnitude, the way that adding a new sense to your hunting group changes what is possible. Think about what cornering looks like in difficult terrain. An elk or a reindeer that has scented a human hunter turns and runs, and a human on foot in deep snow has very little ability to predict where it will go or cut it off. But an animal that can run faster, that can follow by scent rather than sight, that can drive the prey toward the hunters rather than away from them, that changes the geometry of the hunt completely. Whether early dogs were trained to do this deliberately, or whether they developed these behaviours through something more gradual and mutual, more trial and error and accumulated habit, is not something the archaeological record can tell us with certainty. What it can tell us is that the combination was powerful. The suggestion that early dog-human hunting groups were substantially more effective than human groups hunting alone is one that many researchers find plausible, though not yet something archaeology can measure directly. Then there is the question of retrieval, of the animal that goes where the person cannot easily follow. A water bird brought down over a frozen lake, a rabbit driven into deep brush, small game in the kind of terrain that offers a human hunter nothing to follow. The dogs that moved in these spaces that brought things back or at least revealed where they had fallen were filling a gap in human capability that would otherwise have gone unfilled. But hunting, as important as it was, may not have been the most immediate contribution. Consider the camp itself. Consider a group of 30 people in a skin shelter or a rock overhang, somewhere on the edge of the European steppe, with a fire burning low and the darkness pressing in from all sides. The Ice Age night was not empty. Wolves were there, and cave lions and hyenas and bears emerging from hibernation, and all the other animals that shared that world and sometimes regarded sleeping humans as prey. A human watch is imperfect. Watch. People tire. Attention drifts. The fire needs tending, and the tendency to close your eyes after a long day of travelling and foraging and hunting is not something willpower can entirely overcome. The dogs were different. Their hearing was engaged even when they appeared to be sleeping. Their noses were reading the wind constantly, sorting information out of the darkness that no human sensory system could access. When something came close that shouldn't have been close, they would have responded, and that response, that sudden tension or vocalization, would have functioned as an alarm that cost the camp nothing in terms of human vigilance. People could sleep more deeply, knowing the dogs were awake in ways they could not be. This is not a romantic idea. It is a practical one. The reduction in threat from nocturnal predators, the improvement in the quality of sleep, the psychological weight lifted from the humans who no longer needed to maintain quite so intense a watch through the long Ice Age nights. These things have real consequences for survival and for the kind of long-term health and cognitive function that sustained groups across difficult winters. There is also warmth. This may seem a small thing against the drama of hunting and defence, but in a world where cold was one of the most persistent and intimate threats, it was not small at all. A large dog generates heat. Several large dogs sleeping pressed against people in an enclosed space on a night when the temperature outside is well below freezing generates meaningful, possibly critical heat. The phrase "it was a three-dog night," suggesting a night cold enough to require 3 dogs for warmth, preserves something genuine about the older arithmetic of survival. Body heat shared between species, fur against skin, the metabolic warmth of an animal that was also benefiting from the arrangement. This was part of what the partnership offered, and alongside the physical warmth, something less easily measured. Companionship. The presence of an animal that did not flee, that would lie beside a person, that seemed to orient toward human beings rather than away from them, in a world that was largely hostile or indifferent, that had a psychological weight that is difficult to quantify but probably not trivial. Humans are social animals who suffer in isolation and who find genuine comfort in the presence of other beings. The dogs that lived among people were, for whatever complex reasons, a source of that comfort. And comfort is not separate from survival when the alternative is the kind of sustained psychological stress that erodes decision-making and cooperation over long winters. And here the story opens onto a question that is larger and more contested, and worth dwelling on carefully precisely because of that. There is a hypothesis, not a settled conclusion, not something the evidence has confirmed, but a hypothesis with enough internal logic that serious researchers have given it serious attention. It concerns what happened to the Neanderthals. For hundreds of thousands of years, Neanderthals were supremely successful in Europe and Western Asia. They were stronger than modern humans, they had brains at least as large. They were accomplished hunters of large Ice Age mammals. They had fire, tools, burial practices. And then, within a geologically brief span of time after modern humans arrived in Europe, they were gone. The reasons for that disappearance remain genuinely debated. Climate, disease, simple demographic pressure, interbreeding that gradually absorbed them into the modern human population. All of these have been proposed and none has been fully resolved. But there is a version of the story in which the dogs mattered, in which the sensory advantage, the hunting efficiency, the camp security that early dog-human groups possessed, was enough to tip the balance in competition over territories and resources. Modern humans arriving in Europe with dogs would have been, on this account, something qualitatively different from what the Neanderthals had encountered before, not just another kind of human, but a hunting and survival system that the Neanderthals, who appear to have had no equivalent animal partnership, could not easily match. It is a compelling idea. It has the quality of a good hypothesis, which is to say it fits the evidence without being proven by it. Whether it is true, whether the dogs made that specific difference in that specific moment, is not something we can say with confidence. The record is too incomplete, the variables too many, the silence of 30,000 years too deep. What we can say is that the partnership was real, and that it was built for exactly the kind of world the Ice Age was. Cold, dark, dangerous, uncertain, full of things that wanted to eat you, or freeze you, or simply outlast you. In that world, the animals that had chosen to come close to the fire, that had learned to move alongside people and read their intentions and offer their senses and their warmth in return for scraps and shelter, those animals were not a luxury. They were part of how the cold was survived. And then the cold began to let go, not quickly, not in any way that a single human lifetime could have fully perceived, but across generations, across the slow accumulation of winters that came a little later and ended a little sooner. The world that had shaped the earliest dog-human partnership was changing. The glaciers pulled back from their southernmost reach. River systems that had been locked under ice for millennia began to run again. Tundra gave way to shrub gave way to forest, and the great open steppes that had been highways for mammoth and reindeer, and the hunters who followed them began to fragment, broken up by tree line advancing from the south and wetland spreading through the low ground where the melt collected. This was not a simple improvement. It was a transformation, and transformation requires adaptation, which is another way of saying that the old arrangements had to become new ones, whether anyone intended that or not. The megafauna went first, or most of them did. The mammoths that had sustained entire communities through long winters, the woolly rhinoceroses, the giant deer with their improbable antlers that spanned more than 3 meters. These animals thinned and disappeared across a span of several thousand years, pressed by the changing climate and by the increasingly effective hunting that the warming world made possible, and then, perhaps, made too easy. Human hunters who had spent tens of thousands of years perfecting their ability to take down large animals found themselves in a landscape that was filling with smaller, faster, more elusive prey: deer in new woodlands, waterfowl on expanding wetlands, fish in rivers running clear and cold from the retreating ice. The hunting itself had to change, and where the hunting changed, the role of the dogs changed with it. Think about what the warming landscape looked like at ground level, in the sensory texture of daily life. Paw prints in thawing mud at the edge of a river crossing that had been frozen solid for as long as the oldest person in the group could remember. The smell of green things coming back, unfamiliar plant species moving into territory that had been bare gravel and wind-scoured rock within living memory. Birdsong where there had been silence. And somewhere in all of that new noise and new scent and new confusion of edges, the dogs moving through it alongside the people who had, over so many generations, become their people. The dogs that had been most useful in open steppe hunting, running with a group across flat ground toward a large animal that could be driven and surrounded, found themselves in a different geometry. The forests asked for different skills. A dog that could work through dense undergrowth, that could push small game toward hunters waiting on trails, that could track a deer through broken light and leaf litter by scent rather than sight, was valuable in ways that the open country coursing style was not. And the animals that happened to have those qualities that were smaller or more maneuverable or more attuned to close work with their human partners were the ones that survived and reproduced and passed their tendencies on. This is not something anyone planned. It is simply what selection does when the environment changes. But there was something else happening too, something that would prove even more consequential for the long history of dogs than any shift in hunting technique. People were beginning, in certain places and in certain conditions, to stay longer in one place, not permanently, not yet. The fully mobile life was not simply abandoned the morning the glaciers retreated, but the logic that had kept bands perpetually moving, following herds across landscapes that offered little except where the animals were, that logic was loosening. In places where rivers ran reliably, where seasonal salmon runs or migratory waterfowl or dense nut-bearing forests could be counted on to produce food in concentrated abundance, groups began to return to the same locations year after year, and then to linger there longer, and eventually to build structures that implied an intention to come back. For the dogs, this shift mattered enormously. A dog living with a fully mobile band occupied a particular kind of space in the world. It travelled, it helped in the hunt, it guarded the camp against the night, and when the band moved, it either moved with them or it did not. But a dog living with a group that returned each year to the same river bend, the same coastline, the same sheltered valley where the hazelnuts grew thickest, that dog was developing something different. A territory, a sense of place, a location that was worth defending not just tonight but for the season, for the year, for the accumulated investment of a community beginning to feel that this ground was theirs. Guarding, which had always been part of what the dogs offered, became more clearly defined as something with a particular geography. The perimeter of a camp that was rebuilt in the same location was a perimeter that could be learned, its sounds and smells memorized, the usual patterns of movement distinguished from the anomalous. A dog that knew a place, that had spent seasons within the same small radius, was a more effective guardian than one that had never stayed anywhere long enough to understand what ordinary looked like. At the same time, the dogs themselves were spreading. Human groups moving out of the glacial refugia, where they had waited out the worst of the cold, were carrying their animals with them into territories newly opened by the retreating ice. Different lineages of dogs shaped by thousands of years in different refugia came into contact as their human communities came into contact. Some interbred, some probably did not, separated by the same distances and unfamiliarities that kept human groups distinct even when they occasionally met and traded. The genetic picture that researchers are still working to reconstruct from ancient DNA suggests a complex, shifting mosaic of dog populations, some of which mixed freely, and some of which maintained surprising distinctiveness across long periods, shaped by geography and by the particular habits of the communities they travelled with. Smoke began to hang over certain places in a new way, not the brief smoke of a single night's fire, but the accumulated haze of return, of season after season of burning in the same location, charcoal layering into the soil, the smell of cooking and refuse and the specific animal warmth of people and dogs together becoming part of the landscape itself. The dogs were not yet the specialized, differentiated creatures that later centuries would make them. They were still, in most places, something closer to what they had always been. General-purpose animals moving in close relationship with people, useful in ways that resisted easy categorization. But the world they were moving through was beginning to offer new shapes, new possibilities, new pressures that would gradually pull those generalists in different directions. The ice had been the great constant of the partnership's origins. In the ice, the arrangement had been forged. What came after was something more various, more unpredictable, more full of the particular local textures that different landscapes and different human ways of living would press into the relationship over the coming millennia. The thaw was not an ending. It was, in the slow register that these things move in, a beginning of a different kind. Somewhere around 10,000 years ago, in the river valleys and fertile uplands where the first grains were beginning to be harvested rather than simply found, human life began to change in ways that were neither sudden nor fully understood by the people living through them. The shift that archaeologists call the agricultural revolution was not a decision. It was an accumulation. A group that had been collecting wild wheat returned to the same hillside year after year until they began, almost without meaning to manage it. To clear competing plants, to scatter seed, to wait. And waiting, which is another word for staying, changed everything that came after. For dogs, this transformation in human life was as significant as any that had come before it. Perhaps more so. The mobile hunting life, even in its later forms as it had evolved through the warming centuries after the ice, had kept dogs and people in a particular kind of relationship. Movement structured everything. The usefulness of a dog was measured in what it could do while travelling, while pursuing, while surviving in a world that offered no fixed address. But the village, even the earliest and most provisional kind, the cluster of semi-permanent structures set into a hillside near a reliable water source and surrounded by the first rough clearings of cultivated ground, the village asked something different of its animals. It asked them to stay, and staying, over generations, changed what the dogs became. The perimeter of a settled community had a quality that the perimeter of a temporary camp did not. It was the same perimeter every night, the same fence line, the same gap between the grain store and the dwelling wall, the same path worn into the earth between the sleeping place and the water source. A dog living within that geography had the time and the accumulated experience to understand it deeply, to know every ordinary sound and every ordinary smell, and therefore to recognize with a precision that no outsider could match when something was wrong. The bark of a village dog was a specific and valuable communication. It meant that the perimeter had been breached, or approached, or that something unknown was moving in the dark beyond the firelight. In a community that had begun to accumulate stored grain, domesticated animals, and the material wealth that settlement makes possible, that communication was worth more than it had ever been. But it was not only the villages themselves that needed guarding. It was what was inside them. Because the other transformation happening alongside the cultivation of grain was the domestication of herd animals. Goats and sheep in the uplands of the Fertile Crescent, cattle in the river valleys, pigs wherever humans settled and left organic refuse in abundance. These animals changed the economic logic of human communities in ways that rippled outward through every aspect of daily life, including the relationship with dogs. A flock of sheep represented wealth in a form that could move, reproduce, be lost to predators, or simply wander over the hill and not come back. Protecting that wealth was a serious problem, one that required presence and attention across hours and distances that exceeded what any single human herder could reliably provide. The dogs that proved most useful in this new context were not necessarily the same animals that had been most valued in the hunting camp. Size mattered in new ways, the kind of size that could stand between a flock and a wolf or a leopard, and make that encounter one the predator would prefer to avoid. Temperament mattered, an animal that could spend long hours with the herd without disturbing it, that could distinguish the familiar from the threatening without help from a human nearby. And increasingly attentiveness mattered, the willingness to work in partnership with a herder in a directed way, moving animals along a path, bunching them together, responding to signals and sounds in ways that made the whole ungainly business of moving livestock from one piece of ground to another manageable for small numbers of people. None of this happened in a season or a generation. It happened across centuries of ordinary life, in the way that all these changes happened, through the accumulated weight of which animals were useful and which were not, which were kept close and which wandered off and were not replaced. Gradually, without anyone naming what they were doing, the dogs of different communities were becoming different from each other in ways that reflected the tasks those communities needed performed. Not breeds in any modern sense. The word carries too much of a later world's precision, too much of the kennel and the stud book and the deliberate crossing. What was happening was something looser and slower and more organic than that. It was function-first divergence. In the mountain villages where the flocks moved between upland and lowland pastures with the seasons, the dogs accompanying them were shaped, generation by generation, by the particular demands of that work and that terrain. In the river settlements where the concern was the grain store and the sleeping community, the dogs that proved their worth were shaped by a different set of pressures. In the semi-arid margins where small groups kept their animals moving through landscapes that offered little margin for error, different again. Dogs also began to accumulate a different kind of value in this period. The village, with its stores and its livestock and its seasonal surpluses, was a place where status could be measured and displayed in ways that the mobile hunting life had made difficult. Certain dogs, particularly those with unusual colouring, unusual size, unusual temperament, or a demonstrated lineage of usefulness, began to appear in the archaeological record as objects of something more than practical regard. Burial sites from Neolithic communities across the Levant, across early farming settlements in Central Europe and Eastern Asia, show dogs interred with care, sometimes alongside humans, sometimes alone with what appears to be deliberate and considered attention to placement. These were not simply useful tools being stored. They were animals with a social weight, a presence in the community that had meaning beyond function. And where animals carry social meaning, they become things that can be given, traded, offered as expressions of alliance or good faith between communities. The movement of particular dog lineages across the trading networks of early agricultural societies was, in a small way, another kind of diffusion, a slow redistribution of useful genetic material across landscapes that human exchange was knitting together. What this period did, in the long arc of the dog's history, was multiply the relationships. For tens of thousands of years the arrangement had been essentially singular, dogs with hunters, performing variations on a theme that was always recognisably the same. Now the theme began to develop different voices, the guardian at the edge of the village, the herder in the hills, the companion of the emerging classes of people wealthy enough to keep animals purely for the pleasure of their company, the traded animal carrying one community's knowledge of usefulness into another's. The dog was becoming not yet what later centuries would make it, but something more varied than it had been, more differentiated by place and purpose, and the particular human needs that different ways of living pressed into every relationship they touched. The world had settled, and in settling it had asked the dogs to settle with it, and in settling both had slowly, imperceptibly, begun to become something new. And then, across the span of centuries, certain of those human communities that had begun with grain and goat and the rough geometry of village life grew into something that earlier generations could not have imagined. Cities rose from floodplains, temples accumulated stone upon stone until they commanded the horizon. Rulers emerged who could move thousands of people across hundreds of miles by the force of organized belief and organized violence. Civilization, in the sense that later historians would use the word, was arriving in the world. And the dogs were there for all of it. What changes when a society moves from village to city, from local chief to dynastic king, is not only the scale of human organization, it is the scale of human meaning-making, the impulse to find pattern, to assign significance, to look at the recurring features of daily life and ask what they might signify beyond the immediate and the practical. That impulse does not disappear in larger societies. It intensifies. And among the recurring features of daily life in every one of these early civilizations was the dog, present at the threshold, present at the moment of death, present in the spaces between the living world and whatever the living imagined lay beyond it. In Egypt this presence became theological, the figure that would eventually be called Anubis, the god with the head of a canine and the body of a man, associated with embalming and the passage of the dead through the weighing of the heart, did not emerge fully formed from a single imagination. He accumulated over centuries, drawing on something older and more intuitive than doctrine. Dogs had been observed near burial places, They were animals that moved between the living settlement and the margin beyond it, between the firelit interior and the dark outside. They were present at moments of human vulnerability in a way that was hard to ignore and easy to interpret. An animal that accompanies the dying, that lingers near graves, that seems at ease in the spaces where the living feel unease, becomes, in a society organised around elaborate beliefs about death and what follows it, a natural symbol of guardianship at precisely that threshold. The connection between the dog and the divine guardian was reinforced by the existence, across the Egyptian landscape and the wider region, of a type of dog shaped by a particular environment. Lean, deep-chested, built for speed across open ground, with a gaze that could track movement at extraordinary distances. These animals, which had been developing their distinctive form across the arid hunting grounds of the Levant and the Nile corridor over thousands of years, were not produced by deliberate selection in any modern sense. They were produced by landscape. The open desert and semi-desert terrain rewarded sight over scent, speed over endurance, the ability to run down prey in full view rather than follow it through cover. Dogs living and working in those conditions generation after generation became what the terrain required them to be. Long-legged and narrow, capable of burst speed, eyes set in a skull that widened their field of vision, ears that turned towards sound with an almost mechanical precision. These animals appear in Egyptian tomb paintings and carved relief with enough consistency to suggest they were not merely familiar but valued beyond the functional. They are shown wearing collars, lying near their owners, accompanying hunts in which the depiction of the dog is as careful and considered as the depiction of the quarry. Some were given names recorded in inscriptions, a particular intimacy in a culture that understood names as carriers of identity and power. The association of such animals with the elite, with rulers and nobles who could afford the luxury of hunting for pleasure rather than survival, meant that the dog became entangled with status in ways that would persist across the ancient world and far beyond it, further north and east, along the Mediterranean coast, and into the river valleys of the Levant. The archaeological record offers a different kind of evidence. At Ashkelon, on the southern coast of what is now Israel, excavations uncovered a cemetery that contains the remains of more than 1,000 dogs, interred over a period of several centuries during the Persian period. They were not sacrificed. The bones show no marks of violence, no evidence of ritual killing. They were buried with something that looks, across the distance of 25 centuries, like deliberate care. Each animal laid out, positioned, covered. The variety in age suggests that the burials included animals that had died naturally, of old age, of illness, of the ordinary ends of ordinary lives. What this means is genuinely uncertain. The scale of the cemetery suggests an organised community response to animal death, rather than a series of individual decisions, which in turn suggests that these dogs had a status in the community that made their death a matter requiring acknowledgement. Whether this reflects a religious tradition, a practical concern with disease management, or something else entirely is still debated. But what it resists is the easy interpretation that these were simply discarded animals. Something more considered was happening, even if its exact nature remains beyond the reach of the evidence. In Mesopotamia, in the cities built between the Tigris and the Euphrates, the dog occupied yet another position. Here the evidence points less toward the lean, coursing animal of the open desert, and more toward something heavier, more powerful, built for a different kind of work. Large dogs appear in Assyrian palace reliefs, carved with the same meticulous attention to musculature and posture that the artists brought to lions and warriors. They are shown on leashes, controlled but barely, enormous animals with thick necks and heavy frames that suggest selective pressure towards size and force rather than speed. These were animals whose usefulness was measured in what they could deter rather than what they could chase. The protective symbolism of such animals extended into the household. Inscribed clay tablets from Mesopotamian sites include prayers and incantations in which dogs are invoked as guardians against evil, and small dog figurines have been found buried beneath doorways and house foundations, placed there as apotropaic objects, animals whose presence in effigy might reproduce in the spiritual realm the protective function they performed in the physical one. The dog at the door was not only a practical deterrent, but a symbol of a boundary held, of the inside preserved against whatever the outside might send against it. Taken together, these strands of evidence across Egypt and the Levant and Mesopotamia describe something that had happened to the dog's place in human life without anyone having decided it should happen. The animal that had begun as a partner in the hunt, that had become a guardian of the village and a worker with the herd, had also become a carrier of meaning. It stood at thresholds not only in the physical sense, but in the imaginative one. It was the creature between worlds because it had always lived between worlds, between the wild and the domesticated, between the night and the firelight, between the living and wherever the dead go. Civilizations do not invent the meanings they assign to animals. They inherit them, formalize them, carve them into stone and write them into texts and paint them onto walls until they look like doctrine. But underneath the doctrine is always something older. An observation made by someone who had watched a dog sit quietly at the edge of a grave and found in that quiet something worth thinking about for a very long time. By the time Rome had become something more than a cluster of settlements on hills above a river, more than a local power negotiating its survival among neighbours who were themselves still learning what power meant, the dog had already been living inside human civilization for longer than most civilizations had existed. What Rome did was not invent a new relationship with the animal. What Rome did was systematize, expand, carry the existing arrangements of the ancient world along roads that eventually connected the cold edge of Scotland to the Syrian desert, from the Atlantic coast to the borders of Persia, and in doing so mix populations of dogs, lineages shaped by landscapes their descendants would never see, into something new and varied and thoroughly Roman. The dogs of Rome appear in sources as different as the empire itself. In Varro's agricultural writings there are careful, practical observations about the qualities to seek in a farm dog, the colour of the coat, the weight of the frame, the temperament suited to nights of cold and vigilance. In Pliny there are notes on hunting dogs, their origins, their training, the specific qualities that made certain animals more valuable than others in the chase. In the poetry of Ovid and Virgil, dogs appear as they appeared everywhere in the ancient world, as presences whose familiarity was so complete that metaphor drew on them without explanation, the way you draw on something everyone already understands. But for a more intimate portrait of what the dog meant inside a Roman household, inside the ordinary daily texture of a life rather than the refined distance of literature, the most vivid doorway is a mosaic floor in Pompeii. The city was buried in the late summer of 79 CE, covered so quickly and so completely by ash and pumice that it preserved not the monuments of power but the fabric of ordinary existence. The bakeries, the street food counters, the election graffiti on walls, the ruts worn into stone paving by cartwheels that had been making the same turn for generations. And at the entrance to one of the larger houses in the city, set into the floor in small tesserae of black and white, a dog. Lean, collar around its neck, head slightly raised, and beneath it the words, "Cave canem." Beware of the dog. The phrase is so familiar that it is easy to pass over what it actually represents. Here is a threshold. Here is the moment when the street becomes the interior, when the public world gives way to the private one. And at that threshold, not a divine guardian in stone, not an apotropaic figurine buried beneath the foundation in the manner of Mesopotamia, but a very specific, recognizable dog. A dog that any visitor to that house would have read not as symbol, but as information. There is an animal here. It watches this door. The mosaic is a kind of introduction, almost a portrait, depicting something real enough and familiar enough to serve as practical warning, while also being decorative, being composed with genuine care for the image itself. What the mosaic also tells us is that the dog at the gate of a prosperous Pompeian household was something a visitor would take seriously. These were not small, ornamental animals. The Roman estate guardian, the kind of dog Varro described, was large, pale if possible, because pale was less easily mistaken for a wolf in the dark of the countryside, heavily built, slow to warm to strangers and disinclined to forgive their persistence. Columella, another Roman agricultural writer, gave advice on the subject in terms that suggest long, practical experience rather than abstract principle. The dog that protects a property should not be the same dog that accompanies hunting. Their bodies are different. Their temperaments are different. Their uses are different. Rome had begun to think about dogs in something close to the way it thought about other tools and resources, with an interest in matching the particular qualities of the animal to the particular requirements of the task. The lapdog existed alongside the guardian. It existed inside the same houses sometimes. The small, fine-boned dog that appeared in Greek households before Rome came to absorb Greek culture Into its own circulates through Roman sources with a slightly uncomfortable combination of genuine affection and social anxiety. To love a small dog was acceptable, was even charming in certain registers. Poets wrote of the grief attending the death of a beloved pet with what reads as authentic emotion rather than performance. But there was also a Roman awareness that the lapdog could tip from companion into indulgence, into softness, into the particular excess that Roman moralists found evidence for everywhere if they looked hard enough. The dog pressed against a wealthy woman's side in a carved portrait was both a sign of tenderness and, in certain readings, a sign of idle luxury. The same animal meant different things depending on who held it and who was watching. The hunting dogs of Rome accumulated from across the empire's range. From Britain came dogs whose cold, wet landscape had shaped them toward endurance and nosework, following scent through undergrowth across long grey hours. From the Levant came the lean sighthound traditions that the Mediterranean world had been refining for millennia. From Gaul came animals whose size and aggression made them useful at the moment of the kill, rather than the moment of the chase. The roads that moved grain and soldiers and administrative documents also moved animals. Breeds in the modern sense did not exist, but types did, and the empire was a mechanism for mixing those types, for exposing them to each other in ways that a more fragmented world would never have allowed. War made its own demands. Dogs had accompanied armies in the ancient world long before Rome, and Roman armies used them, though the accounts are scattered, and the role was more logistical and more watchful than the dramatic charges of popular imagination. Dogs at the camp perimeter, alert to movement in the dark. Dogs used by specialized units in regions where local knowledge included how to deploy them effectively. The utility was real and undramatic. The same quality of attentiveness and alarm that had made dogs useful at the edge of a Neolithic village transferred to the edge of a military encampment on a cold river, in a province Rome had only recently subdued. What the empire distributed, alongside its laws and its engineering and its taste in floor decoration, was a set of assumptions about what dogs were for and what they were worth. Those assumptions varied. The poor family in a Roman city kept a dog that ate scraps and barked at strangers, and was probably not the subject of any particular reflection. The wealthy villa keeper had a guardian at the gate, and perhaps a small dog inside, and almost certainly a hunting animal somewhere in the outbuildings. The soldier had a dog that slept near his post and whose agitation in the night was information. The same animal, across all of those lives, shaped by the same ancient arrangement that had been accumulating between wolves and humans for longer than anyone in Rome could have conceived. The mosaic dog at the Pompeian threshold is not only a warning, it is a small record of continuity, a sign that something very old was still intact, still present, still watching the door as the world changed around it. While Rome was laying its roads and pressing its assumptions about dogs into the stone floors of provincial towns, something different was happening at the other end of the known world. Not different in the fundamental arrangement, which was always the same arrangement, the animal living close enough to the human to be useful, to be known, to become something more than useful, but different in the particular shape that relationship took when it passed through the filter of an imperial court whose values and aesthetics and ideas about refinement had been accumulating for longer than Rome had existed as a city. In China, dogs had been present for as long as they had been present anywhere. The genetic record suggests a population of domesticated animals in East Asia, stretching back deep into the same prehistoric darkness from which dogs emerged everywhere. The same long, patient divergence from wolf to something else. But what the Chinese court eventually did with that presence was carry certain qualities of the relationship into a register that had no real equivalent elsewhere. The palace dog was not simply a companion, it was a statement. It was an object of aesthetic attention, in the way a garden or a painted scroll could be an object of aesthetic attention, something shaped toward a particular ideal through deliberate and sustained effort across generations. The small dogs that appear in Chinese court records and in the decorative arts of successive dynasties, in glazed ceramic figures and in the careful notations of imperial household records, were animals whose appearance had been considered for a very long time. Flat faces, compressed skulls, coats that required maintenance, temperaments that were legible and manageable in the confined and socially intricate world of a palace. These were not dogs that had drifted into those qualities by accident. They had been moved toward them, the way a river can be moved by patient redirection of its banks, by decisions made over many generations about which animals to keep and which to pass over, which qualities mattered and which did not. The intensity of that selection in a court environment was different in character from the selection that happened in a village or on a steppe. In the village, the dog that survived was the dog that was useful. In the palace, the dog that survived was the dog that pleased, that satisfied some vision of what a small, refined, specifically beautiful animal could be. The pressures in that environment were strange and specific. Access itself became a kind of selective force. A dog that moved through the inner chambers of a court lived among people whose moods were consequential, whose displeasure had weight. An animal that could not read the register of a room, that could not tell the difference between a moment of welcome and a moment when stillness was required, was an animal that created problems, and so over time, whether deliberately or as a byproduct of simply keeping animals that caused fewer problems, what survived in those settings was a particular quality of attentiveness, a sensitivity to the human interior that had always been latent in the dog from the very beginning of the relationship, but which the palace concentrated and refined. This is worth pausing over, because it returns to something that runs beneath all of this history. The dog's great original gift was not its nose or its strength or its speed, though it had all of those things. Its great original gift was proximity, the willingness to remain close, to orient toward the human face, to track the human mood, to notice the small shifts in posture and breath and expression that signal whether a moment is safe or dangerous, welcoming or cold. That gift existed in the wolf somewhere, latent, waiting. Domestication drew it out, and the palace, in its own enclosed and socially pressured way, drew it out further still. But the palace was not all of China, and China was not all of the East. Across the vast and varied landscape of Asia, dogs were living lives that had nothing to do with glazed ceramics or court aesthetics. In the villages and on the trade routes and in the herding territories that stretched from the lowlands to the high, cold places where the air thinned and the winters lasted longer than they had any right to, dogs were doing what dogs had always done in the world beyond the palace walls, guarding flocks against wolves and leopards, accompanying hunters through mountain terrain that required an animal with endurance and the specific intelligence of a creature that understands a hunt rather than simply participating in it, moving with families and their animals across seasonal routes where the dog's presence at the edge of the camp was the difference between a night that passed quietly and a night that did not. These animals were shaped by work in the way the palace dog was shaped by proximity to power, heavier, often, harder, less concerned with human moods and more concerned with the particular information the landscape provided, the scent on the wind, the movement at the tree line, the sound that did not belong. The diversity of dogs across Asia in any historical period was a diversity of functions and of climates, and of the particular pressures that different human lives placed on the animal. Not a single thing, but many things, held together by the ancient shared origin that the genetics eventually confirmed even when the visible appearance made the connection seem implausible. The temptation, looking back at all of this, is to draw clean lines, to say that this dog that exists today descends in an unbroken thread from that dog recorded in some ancient text, that the Pekingese of a Victorian drawing room is simply the palace dog of a Tang dynasty court, carried forward intact through 1,000 years. But the history does not really support that kind of tidiness. The dogs that exist today in any form were standardized mostly in the 19th century, when Western interest in classification and documentation turned the varied and overlapping populations of working and companion animals into something fixed and named and officially described. What existed before that standardization was more fluid. Animals moved along trade routes. Populations mixed at the edges of empires. A dog that one dynasty considered refined might be crossed with something brought from a distant region, and what emerged from that crossing might carry forward only some of what had come before. The idea of an ancient breed with an uninterrupted lineage is almost always more complicated in practice than it appears in the telling. Genetics can identify ancient population signatures, regions where certain lineages have more depth than others, areas where the dog's presence reaches back into a deep past that predates the written record, but that is not the same as a straight line from one name type to another. The history of dogs in the East, like the history of dogs everywhere, is a history of currents, and mixing and loss and recovery, shaped by human decisions that were rarely made with posterity's curiosity in mind. What persisted through all of that movement and mixing was something more durable than any particular appearance or any particular function. It was the relationship itself, the dog in a Chinese palace reading the mood of a room it could not leave, the dog on a Himalayan trade route staying close to the fire it had found its way to, the dog at the edge of a steppe settlement watching the dark beyond the light, all of them doing the same thing that the wolf had begun doing at the edge of a campfire somewhere in the long cold before any of this was recorded, staying close, watching, orienting toward the warmth of the human world and finding, generation after generation, that it was worth remaining there. There is a particular kind of distance that the Americas represent in this story. Not just geographic distance, though that is real enough, a landmass separated from the great dog-keeping civilizations of Eurasia by oceans wide enough that no information passed between them for most of the time dogs and humans were together. But a conceptual distance too, because when the first humans crossed into the Americas, carrying with them whatever they carried, the story of dogs in the world was already old. The domestication process, wherever it had happened and however long it had taken, was already behind them. The animal that walked into the Americas was not a wolf in the process of becoming something, it was already the other thing, already changed, already oriented in that deep structural way toward the human world. When that crossing happened is a question that remains genuinely open. The most widely accepted picture places the first humans in the Americas somewhere around 15 to 20,000 years ago, moving through or along the edges of the ice during a window when passage was possible, when the great glaciers had not yet closed every route or had already begun to retreat enough to open them again. Whether dogs came with those first people, or followed in later migrations, or arrived through some combination of movements that the genetics has not yet fully resolved, is something researchers continue to work through. The ancient DNA evidence suggests that dogs were in the Americas long enough to diverge meaningfully from their Asian relatives, that they had time to become something shaped by the particular pressures of a new world, before European contact in the 15th century introduced a different wave of animals that would eventually overwhelm most of what had been there before. That loss is part of the story. The dogs that existed in the Americas before European arrival left only fragments behind in the bone record, in the genetic traces still carried by a small number of surviving populations, in the written and pictorial records of the civilizations that had lived alongside them for thousands of years. What those fragments suggest is something familiar in outline and varied in expression. Dogs adapting to new ecologies, to new diets, to new human social arrangements. Dogs becoming whatever the particular conditions of the place and the people required them to become, too. In the high-dry regions of Mesoamerica, one of those local expressions became something remarkable enough that it survived, in attenuated but recognizable form, into the present. The dog known now as the Zoloites quintli, which carries in its name the syllables of older naming systems that reach back into a world before Spanish record-keeping, is a hairless animal, or nearly so. A quality that seems improbable at first, given that dogs in cold climates tend toward density and warmth, but which in the specific thermal conditions of the regions where this animal lived, was perhaps simply not selected against, or was selected for in ways related to the particular ecological pressures of those environments. The skin exposed to air, the body warm to the touch in a way that coated dogs are not, the warmth rising directly from the surface. The relationship between these dogs and the people who kept them was layered in the way that relationships between humans and animals become layered when they persist long enough through the accumulated weight of daily proximity and symbolic significance. They were companions. That part is old, older than any civilization, older than any formal belief system. The simple fact of the animal present in the household, known individually, sleeping near the warmth, tracking the human through the ordinary movements of the day. But in Mesoamerica, the dog had also accumulated meaning in the register, where communities place the things they find most consequential. Dogs appear in the ceramic traditions of several cultures in the region, in figurines that are sometimes naturalistic and sometimes stylized toward something more than animal, that suggest the dog occupied a position in the imagination that was not purely practical and not purely symbolic, but something that moved between those categories with the ease of an animal that had always lived at the border between the human world and whatever lay beyond it. The specific beliefs attached to dogs in these contexts varied as they varied everywhere, shaped by the particular cosmological frameworks of different peoples in different places and times. What appears consistently enough across the record to be noticed is the idea of the dog as a creature associated with passage, with thresholds, with the movement between states. Whether this is because dogs actually live at thresholds, at the edge of the camp, at the boundary between the familiar and the dark, and human imagination simply recognized what was already physically true, or whether the symbolic weight preceded and organized the observation, is a question without a clean answer. Probably both things were happening at once, as they usually do when humans build meaning around the animals they live closest to. What is worth holding on to in considering all of this is that the ritual associations were not separate from the everyday ones. The dog that carried symbolic weight in a formal context was the same animal that ate scraps and slept in doorways, and was known by the people of a particular household with the specificity that comes from daily contact over years. The sacred and the domestic were not opposed. They were two registers of the same long relationship, and the fact that the dog appeared in both of them is itself a kind of testimony to how deeply it had settled into the human world. Across the wider continents, in the forests of the northeast, and the grasslands of the interior and the river systems of the south, other dogs were living other versions of the same arrangement, hauling loads, accompanying hunters through terrain that required the specific gifts the dog had always brought to a hunt, the nose reading the invisible text of the ground, the body capable of sustained effort over distances that would exhaust an unassisted human pursuit. Kept close in some communities and more loosely in others, shaped by diet and climate and the particular expectations of the people they moved among. The dogs of the subarctic, where pulling weight across snow was a practical necessity rather than a marginal advantage, developed in directions suited to that work. The dogs of the forests adapted to the particular rhythms of forest hunting, each population settling into the niche that the local version of human life had opened for it. The dog, in the Americas as everywhere else, was not one thing. It was an idea that local conditions had expressed in local forms, the way a single language carried into new terrain by migrating populations becomes over centuries a family of related languages that are recognizably connected and yet distinct enough to require translation. The underlying structure was the same, the ancient original agreement, the willingness to remain close, the capacity to orient toward the human face and find something they're worth remaining for. But the surface varied enormously, shaped by 10,000 years of continent-specific pressures, by the climates and ecologies and belief systems and practical requirements of hundreds of different peoples spread across two vast landmasses. What the Americas add to the history of dogs is a reminder that the relationship was not fragile. It had crossed an ocean's worth of distance and an ice age's worth of difficulty and had arrived, intact, on the far side of the world, and then had continued quietly and persistently to become whatever it needed to become. The dog followed the human into the new world, and then went on following them, as it always had, staying close, watching, finding the campfire wherever it was lit. The world the dog entered after the ice, after the first villages and the first empires, was a world in the process of sorting itself into layers, hierarchies of land and blood and name, and in medieval Europe the dog was sorted too, placed within the same rigid architecture of rank and privilege that organized everything else, from the grain in the field to the timber in the forest to the right to carry a sword. What a person could do with a dog depended almost entirely on what kind of person they were, and what kind of dog they kept said something about them that could not easily be unsaid. The hunting dog in particular was a statement. A lord riding out with a pair of tall, clean-limbed sighthounds moving alongside the horse was displaying something more than a preference for coursing hares. He was displaying ownership over the landscape itself, over the right to pursue the animals that moved through it. In much of medieval Europe, the game laws that governed hunting were among the most strictly enforced legal instruments that existed. The forests were royal property, the deer were royal property. The act of hunting them without permission was not a minor infraction, but a transgression against the social order, and the dog that enabled that transgression was evidence of it. Dogs of a certain quality were legally restricted to those of a certain rank. A peasant found with a greyhound, or an animal that resembled one closely enough to raise suspicion, faced penalties that could be severe. The dog as a tool of privilege was not a metaphor, it was written into the statutes. What drove the divergence of working types during this period was not theory but function, pressed steadily over generations into form. The sighthound had already been developing for centuries along the lines that fast, open country pursuit required. Long legs, deep chest, narrow waist, eyes placed to give the widest possible field of vision. an animal built to see a target at great distance and close that distance before the target understood what was happening. These were the dogs of aristocratic coursing, kept lean and valued for speed and elegance, occupying a place in the noble household that was almost ceremonial in its precision. The scent hound was something different in almost every way that mattered. Lower to the ground, heavier in the body, with ears that swept the air forward toward the nose, and a vocal apparatus used to tell the hunter something was happening, even when the hunter could not see it. These were dogs built for the kind of hunting that did not require a single blazing sprint, but a long, patient working of a cold trail through undergrowth and muddy ground, following a thread of information that no human sense could detect. They were working in partnership, in a way that required the hunter to listen as much as to look, to follow the dog's reading of the landscape rather than to direct it. A different relationship, more collaborative in its dailiness, built on the specific trust that develops between two animals who are genuinely dependent on each other's abilities. The herding dogs were doing something else again. As agriculture settled human life more completely, and livestock became a primary measure of wealth, the dog that could hold a flock together, that could read the edges of a group of animals and apply exactly the right pressure to correct a drift without causing a panic, was enormously valuable, not as a symbol, not as property in the legal sense that the greyhound was property, as a working partner in the most practical register imaginable, without whom the shepherd could not do the work that needed doing. These dogs were shaped by that requirement the way water shapes stone, gradually and completely, until the form and the function became almost the same thing. And then there were the others, the dogs that do not appear in the illuminated manuscripts of noble households or in the legal texts governing hunting privileges, the curs at the edges of every medieval village, animals of no particular type and no particular owner, existing in the gap between the domesticated and the feral that dogs have always been able to inhabit. Ratters in the grain stores, guardians sleeping across the doorway of a cottage, animals that followed the cart to market and came back with it, that ate what was thrown and gave back presence and alertness, and the particular safety that comes from having something nearby that will hear what you cannot hear and wake before you wake. These dogs had no legal status and no recorded history, but they were probably the dogs that most people who lived in medieval Europe actually knew. The dog of the everyday rather than the dog of the ideal. Plague changed something in how Europeans related to the natural world, including to animals, though the change was not simple or uniform or easily summarized. The years in which the plague moved through the continent were years of a particular kind of fear, the kind that looks for causes in the wrong places because the right places are too difficult to see. Animals were implicated in ways that seem strange to a modern eye, caught up in the general suspicion that gathered around anything that moved at the edge of the human world, that lived in the intermediate space between the village and the dark. Dogs and cats both accumulated a portion of that anxiety, associated in some times and places with the uncanny, with disease itself in its incomprehensible invisibility. There were episodes of killing, of animals driven out or destroyed on the basis of associations that had more to do with fear than with understanding. But it is worth being careful here, because fear and care existed together, as they always do when the relationship is old enough. The same communities that sometimes turned against the animals at the gate also kept them close, valued them, mourned individual ones, demonstrated in hundreds of small recorded ways that the bond was not so easily dissolved. The plague did not end the medieval dog. It moved through, as plague does, and left the arrangement essentially intact, altered in texture perhaps, marked by the particular grief and confusion of those years, but not fundamentally broken. What the medieval period did, across all of this, was press the dog's various capacities into increasingly specific forms, function asking the body to become something, and the body, over generations, complying. The relationship between working type and physical form becoming more defined, more legible, so that by the time the medieval period was ending and something else was beginning, the landscape of dogs in Europe contained animals that looked quite different from one another and did quite different things. Not because anyone had planned it that way, not because there were theories in circulation about how a dog should be built, but because work had shaped them the way it always shapes the things it uses long enough, quietly, incrementally, until the form carried the record of the function, the way a hand carries the record of what it has spent its life holding. What the medieval period had pressed into form through centuries of work and function, the 19th century would take apart and rebuild according to entirely different principles. Not the principles of the field or the forest, or the cold trail through undergrowth, but the principles of the exhibition hall, the printed standard, the judge's eye moving along a measuring tape. The dog was about to enter a new kind of world, and the world would leave marks on it that are still visible today. The context matters, because nothing about what happened to dogs in the Victorian era makes sense without understanding what was happening to the people around them. Britain in the mid-19th century was urbanising at a pace that had no real precedent in human history. Cities swelled with people who'd come from places where animals were working presences, daily realities, and found themselves living in terraced houses on gaslit streets, where the only animal they might keep was a small one, a quiet one that fit inside the dimensions of a domestic life that had contracted around them. The middle class was growing, accumulating a kind of prosperity that expressed itself partly in leisure, in the cultivation of taste, in the demonstration that one had enough comfort to care about things that were not strictly necessary. Pets were part of that demonstration. A dog on the hearthrug was not just a dog. It was evidence of a certain kind of household, a certain kind of sensibility, and into this atmosphere of urban prosperity and organised leisure came something that would change the dog more profoundly than any development since the first villages. In 1859, in Newcastle, upon Tyne, the first modern dog show was held. It was modest by later standards, focused on sporting dogs, attended by people who were already part of a culture of competitive breeding. But the principle it established was not modest at all. Dogs could be evaluated against one another, not on the basis of what they did in the field, but on the basis of how they looked. Appearance could be standardized, measured, judged, ranked. The winning dog was not necessarily the fastest or the most tireless or the most attuned to the particular intelligence of its handler. The winning dog was the one that most precisely matched an agreed-upon description of what the ideal version of that type should look like. The appetite for this kind of competition grew quickly, as appetites for organised spectacle tend to do when the conditions are right. Within a few years, dog shows were drawing large crowds and generating the kind of serious argument about standards and judging and eligibility that only happens when people have decided that something matters enough to argue about seriously. The obvious next step was some kind of organising body that could make the arguments less endless by establishing rules everyone agreed to follow, or at least agreed to be bound by. In 1873, the Kennel Club was founded in England. It began keeping a stud book. Pedigrees became official, traceable, verifiable. A dog's lineage was now a document as much as a physical reality, a written record that could be inspected and certified, and used to establish that an animal belonged to a recognised type with a recognised history. This is where something quietly remarkable happened. Remarkable in a way that took a long time to fully understand. The Kennel Club and the institutions that followed it in other countries did not only organise the dogs that already existed, they also organised the stories told about those dogs. And some of those stories reached much further back into history than the evidence comfortably supported. Breeds that had been loosely defined regional types, or recently assembled populations or animals that a small group of enthusiasts had spent a few decades deliberately shaping, began to acquire histories that placed their origins in deep antiquity. Ancient Egypt, Imperial China, the Celtic tribes of the pre-Roman North. The origins became part of the appeal, part of what gave a breed its character and its prestige. The older the lineage, the argument seemed to go, the more authentic the animal, the more it carried within it something irreducible and particular that careful breeding had merely preserved rather than created. The myth-busting here needs to be gentle, because the people who built these narratives were not, for the most part, deliberately deceiving anyone. They were doing what people do when they care about something and want to give it weight and meaning. They were reaching for history to dignify the present. But the genetic record, which has become considerably more legible in recent decades, tells a more complicated story. Many of the breeds that were formalised in the Victorian era and given ancient lineages are, in the terms that matter genetically, largely 19th century constructions. The physical standards were new, the closed gene pools were new, the names were sometimes new. Animals that had existed in various forms across wide regions were gathered up, selected toward a particular appearance, and then declared to be a distinct and ancient type that had always looked this way. This is not to say there was nothing real being worked with. The sighthound type is genuinely ancient. Dogs that look broadly like what we now call herding breeds were doing herding work for a very long time before anyone organised a show. The general shapes that function had pressed into existence over centuries were real inheritances. but the specific breed, the precise standard, the registered pedigree, the closed population that bred only within itself, these were Victorian inventions in a way that earlier dog types were not. The distinction matters, and it matters in a way that goes beyond historical accuracy. Because the moment a breed's pedigree was closed, the moment the stud book said that only registered animals of that type could produce registered animals of that type, something changed in the genetics of those populations. The variation that had always existed in open, regionally diverse dog populations, variation that carried within it the redundancy and flexibility that any living system needs to respond to new pressures, began to contract. Closed gene pools do not replenish themselves. The animals that were registered in the 1870s or 1880s became the ancestors of every registered animal that followed, and the narrowing that came from that founding population compounded quietly over generations, largely invisible until the consequences began to surface in ways that were harder to ignore. And there was something else working alongside the narrowing of the gene pool. The standards that the shows rewarded were not always the standards that function had originally shaped. When the judge's eye replaced the working field as the measure of what a dog should be, the selection pressure shifted. Characteristics that looked impressive or distinctive in the ring, the degree of a coat's profusion, the set of an ear, the particular angle of a head, these could be selected for independently of whether they helped the animal do the work its ancestors had done. The working dog and the show dog were not always incompatible, but they were not always the same animal either. Over generations, the divergence between the two could become significant, and in some populations it did. By the time the 19th century closed and the 20th began, the landscape of dogs in Europe had been reorganized in ways that would have been difficult to explain to any shepherd or hunter from the medieval world. There were registered breeds and unregistered breeds. There were dogs that could be shown and dogs that could only be used. There were stud books and championship titles and printed standards describing in precise language what the ideal version of dozens of different types should look like. It was an extraordinary apparatus of organization, built in a remarkably short time, driven by genuine love for dogs and genuine pleasure in their variety. And it carried within it, like a slow current in still water, consequences that were only just beginning. The century that began with stud books and show rings would not stay organized in that way for long. History has a habit of interrupting the arrangements that people make in times of relative peace, and the 20th century was not a time of relative peace. What came next would ask different things of dogs entirely, things that had nothing to do with the judge's eye or the printed standard, and the dogs would answer those demands in ways that said something old and unambiguous about the nature of what they were. When the First Great War came to Europe, the armies that marched into it brought dogs with them, not as symbols or mascots, though they became those things too in the retelling, but as working animals filling specific roles that the machinery of industrial warfare had created and then found it could not fill by itself. The Western Front was a world of noise and darkness and collapsed communication, where telephone lines were cut by artillery and runners were killed before they arrived, and the distances between positions that needed to speak to each other were measured in mud and wire, and the constant possibility of death. Dogs moved through that landscape in ways that men often could not. They carried message cylinders through terrain that would have exposed a human soldier to immediate fire. They located wounded men in the shell-churned ground between positions, lying down beside them to wait, or returning to their handlers to lead them back. They guarded supply depots and forward positions through long cold nights when human sentries struggled with exhaustion and cold. The numbers involved were not small. Germany had trained tens of thousands of dogs before the war began, having recognized earlier than most that the role would be significant. France, Britain, Belgium, and eventually other nations followed with their own programs. These were not casual arrangements. The training was systematic, the records were kept, the results were evaluated. Dogs died in those years in numbers that were never fully counted. They were exposed to gas and shell fire, and all the particular violence of a war that had achieved a scale of destruction new in human experience. What they received in return was the food, and the handling and the proximity to people that had structured their existence since the beginning of the arrangement. The transaction was the same one it had always been, carried into circumstances that no earlier version of it could have anticipated. The Second Great War asked similar things and added new ones. Detection work became more formalized, the ability of a dog's nose to locate what human senses could not being applied to mines and hidden caches, and a dozen other problems that the specific geography of that conflict created. The Pacific Theatre, the North African campaigns, the forests of Europe, all of them produced their own particular demands, and dogs were adapted to meet them with the same flexibility that had always characterized the working relationship. There was nothing triumphant in any of this. The sober fact of it was that an animal whose ancestors had walked into Firelight perhaps 30,000 years before was now moving through the worst violence human civilization had yet produced, still doing what it had always done, staying close, attending, working alongside. When the wars ended and the world began the slow process of rebuilding itself, the dogs came with that too, into a landscape that was changing in ways that would reshape the relationship once again. The post-war decades in Europe and North America were decades of movement, of families leaving cities for suburbs, of prosperity distributing itself more widely than it had before, of households acquiring things they had not previously been able to afford. Among those things, increasingly, was a dog that was not primarily a working animal. Not a herding dog or a guard dog or an animal kept for any specific economic function, but a companion, a presence in the household, an animal that children grew up alongside and adults came home to at the end of the working day. This was not entirely new. Dogs had been kept as companions for a very long time, in the households of people wealthy enough to maintain animals without demanding economic return from them. But the scale of it was new. The suburban family dog of the mid-20th century represented a democratization of something that had previously been confined to particular classes and particular kinds of households. Veterinary care, which had existed in various forms for centuries but had been applied primarily to working and agricultural animals, began to orient itself toward this new constituency. Vaccines, surgeries, treatments for chronic conditions, the whole apparatus of medical attention that the 20th century was developing for human patients was being extended carefully and incrementally to the animals that lived inside human homes. A dog in 1955 might receive care that a dog in 1905 would not have been considered worth providing. And alongside the family pet, the working dog continued in forms that the previous century had not fully anticipated. Sled dogs in the far north were still doing work that no machine could reliably replicate in the conditions they operated in, pulling weight across ice and snow with an efficiency and adaptability that mechanical alternatives struggled to match. Herding dogs on farms across the world were still managing livestock with the attentiveness and responsiveness that centuries of selection had built into them. But new roles were emerging too, roles that reflected the specific needs of modern societies. Police dogs became a formal institution in many countries, trained for tracking and for the controlled application of force in ways that extended what their handlers could do alone. Search and rescue work, which had existed in informal versions for a long time, was organized and professionalized, the dog's nose being applied to disaster sites and wilderness searches with a methodical seriousness that reflected how well people had come to understand what that particular capacity could do. Then there were guide dogs, and the guide dog represented something genuinely new in the long history of the arrangement. Not a dog working alongside a person to accomplish a shared physical task, but a dog extending the perceptual world of a person whose own perception had been limited, becoming in a quite literal sense the eyes of someone who could not see. The programs that developed this work in the 20th century were building on an intuition that had probably been acted on informally for much longer, but what they created was systematic and careful, and produced partnerships of a kind that said something remarkable about the depth of what was possible between these two species. The trust required was not small on either side. A person walking into traffic because their dog had indicated it was safe to cross was trusting in a way that had no real precedent in the working relationships of earlier centuries. What the 20th century had done, in its violent and then its more peaceful passages, was not to invent a new relationship between people and dogs. It was to find new expressions for something that had been finding new expressions continuously for 30,000 years or more. Each time the world reorganized itself around new pressures and new possibilities, dogs had reorganized alongside it, not because they were endlessly malleable, in the way that objects are malleable, but because the original arrangement had been flexible enough and deep enough to accommodate changes that no one at the beginning could have imagined were coming. The world that the 20th century was building was still in motion, and the dogs were still in it, moving with it, as they had always moved. The world that the 20th century built kept building into the 21st, and the dogs came with it into that too, into a present that holds more recognized breeds than any previous era of the arrangement had produced, and more confusion about what that abundance means, and more questions about what it costs. There are somewhere around 400 recognized breeds in the world today, depending on which registry you consult and how you count, and the variety among them is a thing that rewards quiet contemplation. An Irish wolfhound and a Chihuahua are the same species. A Basenji and a St. Bernard share a common ancestor that is only a handful of thousands of years removed from both of them, which in evolutionary terms is almost nothing at all. The visible diversity that selective breeding has produced in this animal is extraordinary by any biological measure, a testament to how responsive the genome has been to the pressures that people applied to it, intentionally and otherwise, across all those centuries of working together. But that diversity came at a cost that the science of the last few decades has made increasingly legible. When breed registries closed their stud books in the Victorian period and afterward, fixing the gene pool of each breed into a defined circle of allowable ancestry, they also concentrated whatever vulnerabilities were already present in those populations. Breeding within closed lines, generation after generation, tends to produce animals that reliably resemble each other, which was the intention, but it also tends to reduce the genetic variation that buffers a population against inherited illness. This is not a story about carelessness or cruelty. The people who built those breeds were working with the understanding they had, which did not yet include what genetics would eventually reveal about the relationship between population size and disease risk. The bottleneck effects that formed our own species during those desperate millennia in Africa operated by the same logic, concentrating certain traits while narrowing the range of variation in ways that had lasting consequences. In dogs, that same dynamic played out in compressed time within individual breeds, and the result is that some of the most visually distinctive breeds carry elevated risks for conditions that are written into their genomes as surely as the shape of their ears or the texture of their coats. The recognition of this has been gradual and is ongoing, and it has produced, among other responses, a quiet shift in how many people think about what they want when they want a dog. The mixed breed animal, which was the dominant form of dog for most of the arrangement's history, and which the Victorian project of standardization had implicitly cast as inferior, has been returning to favor in ways that reflect changed values around function and health, and the kind of identity people are looking for in the animals that share their homes. Some of this has taken the form of deliberate crosses between established breeds, producing animals that people name with compound words and pay considerable sums for, which has its own complications. But some of it is simply a renewed appreciation for the unrepeatable individual, the dog whose ancestry is a long, unstandardized conversation between many different lines, carrying a genetic diversity that no closed stud book was ever designed to preserve. Meanwhile, the science of origins has continued its own patient work. Ancient DNA extracted from bones found in caves and burial sites, and the frozen margins of archaeological sites keeps revising and refining the story that researchers thought they understood, and the story keeps resisting simple resolution. The window of domestication moves slightly as each new analysis arrives. The geographic question, where the split between wolves and proto-dogs first occurred, and whether it happened once or several times in several places, remains genuinely open in ways that honest scientists are careful to acknowledge. The relationship between the earliest domestic dogs and the wolves that are alive today is more complicated than early models suggested. Every answer seems to produce two more questions, which is perhaps appropriate for a process that unfolded across tens of thousands of years of incremental, undocumented change. The story's not finished being told. It may never be entirely finished. But here, in the present, where all of that history has arrived, there is a dog asleep at the foot of a bed. The room is quiet. The breathing is slow and regular, interrupted occasionally by the small movements that suggest a dream of some kind, some interior landscape the animal is moving through alone. Outside, whatever the world is doing, it is doing without this particular dog's attention, because this dog is warm and close to a person, and that is, for the moment, all the situation requires. It is such a simple image that it is easy to forget what it contains. 30,000 years of incremental trust. Every fire that was approached and every hand that was extended and every generation that came to terms with the presence of the other. Somewhere in that long passage, wolves became dogs not only because people selected them and shaped them, but because something in them moved toward the arrangement willingly. They chose us back, and the evidence of that choice is here, in this room, in the weight of a sleeping animal that has decided this is where it belongs. If this slow journey through the history of dogs has been good company tonight, A like or a comment or a subscription would mean a great deal, and this channel would be glad to keep you company again. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Every corner of the world that shows up there is its own small reminder of how far this arrangement has spread. And if you'd like to go deeper into the prehistoric secrets that shape the world we live in, there is a book waiting for you at sleepytimehistory.com.